Rob. You've certainly got your own accomplishments in this field, and I think it's really a field in which you get interested because you're passionate about doing it. I'm not sure that the science of it is as rigorous as it could be, and I don't view myself as a mentoring scientist. I just do it because I like doing it. It's important for young investigators and for the institutions. I'm going to talk today about some suggestions I have about effective mentoring and how to measure it. And there are really kind of two parts to the talk. So the first part would be just describing what I think is an effective mentee-mentor relationship, what's needed for the success of that, and the reasons they sometimes fail, and then how to suggest recommendations about measuring effectiveness. The latter part of the talk is actually the more challenging part. So I think the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what do mentees need? And actually the list is a very long one. If you think about the kinds of things junior investigators need to be successful, and I just want to make sure that everyone understands, I'm really talking today about junior clinical translational researchers. I'm not really talking about clinician educators in much detail. This is about folks that are mostly clinically oriented researchers. And I'm not going to go over this laundry list, but they certainly need almost all of these to be successful. And right at the bottom there is mentorship. It's not there at the bottom because it's the least important, but I wanted to make sure you recognize all the other things that they need. And so let's talk a little bit about what mentoring involves. And it actually involves a whole bunch of different responsibilities. You can kind of break them up into communication, content mentoring around the research area, career and professional development. And then I think it's very important that mentees are a psychosocial support system for mentors, or a psychosocial support system for the mentees. Again, I'm not going to go over all these lists. You have the slides, you can listen, you can read all of these at a later time, but communication is a very important part of this good mentoring, feedback, establishing expectations, listening skills, managing conflict, fostering trust, very important, all of this. And then in the content mentoring, that's really the research subject, the research study the mentee is doing is identifying gaps in knowledge, identifying training opportunities, resources, formulating aims, designing the study, monitoring the progress, all of those things. And in the end, the mentor needs to step aside to allow the mentee independence in a career path. On the career and professional development side, those are different kinds of strategies that you need to employ for successful career development. These are really things like networking, opportunities, making sure that the mentee has connections with those in the field, promoting that mentee, making sure that they get promoted within their institution, helping to ensure that they have sufficient protected time, navigating the system. Those are all things that are different to the research, design, experimental study aspects to it. And then the psychosocial support, making sure that there's good work-life balance, time management, demonstrating leadership skills, all of those issues, and serving as a role model. So you can see it's actually a pretty tall order to be a successful mentor. If you want to do it well, you've got to really address all of those 4 lines of mentoring responsibilities. And I'm not going to go into much more detail about that. So what are the keys to the relationship to make sure all of those things are done effectively? And I think the mentee has to recognize that at a fundamental level, they are ultimately responsible for the mentor-mentee relationship. Number 3, I'll talk about in a minute, they really need to take charge. So first they have to find a mentee, or in fact, nowadays it's often more than one mentee. There's often a mentoring team. One needs to clarify your goals, and I'll talk about individual development plans, taking charge of that relationship, and knowing when perhaps to move on from the mentoring relationship. So let's talk about finding a mentee or two. As I mentioned, nowadays, a lot of mentees are actually requiring a team of mentors. There is the main research mentor that's helping with the experimental design. There's the career mentor that's really helping with career development and, and promotion. You often have co-mentors that might relate to some areas of the research. There's peer mentoring, which is very important. For example, K scholars at MUSC, we have a K club, and these are, we come together with some senior people, but the K scholars themselves act as mentors to each other, and that's becoming a very important part of mentoring. And then you often have advisors. These are people that aren't really mentoring, but they do offer advice. So you can see there's this whole team. And so the question is, how do you formulate this team if you're a junior investigator? Well, if you really don't have any mentors and you're applying for a job, it's really your chair that during the interview process should already be thinking about who the people are at that institution that could mentor. Many good candidates for jobs would actually be interviewing there because they know that there are people in that institution that could be mentors. But ask around and then schedule a meeting with a prospective mentor and see if there's a mutual interest, if there's a good fit, if there's chemistry, if there's potential for reciprocity, because mentors usually want something out of it too. And so it's helpful to have an interview and see if it works. And during that interview, be very specific about what it is that you see that you need from that relationship. And then once you've established that it may work, talk about how frequently you should meet, how you would communicate. Would it be by meetings, email, how often? And then always have a plan to reevaluate the mentor in 6 to 12 months and give feedback. And I'll talk more about that at the end. So that you can decide both of you can decide whether it's worth pursuing. So those are some kind of general, they're relatively vague, but they're important tips for you to figure out who your mentor should be. But again, your leadership, your chair, other senior faculty are going to be very important for helping you figure out who these mentors are. Clarifying your goals. So one of the most important things you can do, and actually we require it here, and the Delaware group do as you're applying for support from the different programs, is that you actually develop an individual development plan as part of the application process. And it's a very important tool to help you figure out your short-term and long-term goals. And it's used by the mentor to help facilitate communications and evaluate the progress of the mentee. So the first part of developing an IDP, as we call it, is actually conducting a skills assessment. And so this is actually taken from our CTSA grant we're having to resubmit in January, Rob. So we're working on our KL2 mentoring plan. And this is actually part of the needs assessment. You can see that the different domains are research design methodology, human subjects protection, research ethics, data collection, management, interpretation, dissemination, research administration, grant writing, professional development, computer skills. And then there are a whole list of skill sets that we think scholars should have under each of these categories. So someone who was trying to write an IDP would look at this and rate where they thought they stood with respect to all of the skill sets they would need. And out of that rating, you would pretty much quickly realize what it is that you would need to focus on. And then on your IDP, you would develop an IDP that allowed you to attain the skills over a particular time frame that made sense. So you would complete your IDP, and then you need to implement your IDP. Firstly, you have your mentor look at the IDP, and then implement the steps in order to accomplish the goals of the IDP. And you would obviously need to review the progress of your IDP every time. Not every time you meet your mentor, because you could be meeting weekly, but certainly quarterly, every 6 months, and no longer than a year would you go without looking at that to make sure you're keeping on track with respect to meeting those goals. This is very important, the third aspect, which is taking charge of the relationship. Too many times I've seen mentees, and I've personally had mentees who's sitting there waiting like an empty vessel for you to kind of fill them up and tell them what to do. And that's really not a good thing. The mentee really should be the active participant shaping the relationship and saying what it is that they need. It's not just waiting for the mentor to give you advice and so-called wisdom, but it's really the mentee asking for direction, asking for help, and taking charge of the relationship. So it's kind of learning how to manage up is a very key part of being an effective mentee. And then knowing when to move on, and we'll talk about unsuccessful mentoring relationships in a little bit, but again, meeting annually to assess the mentorship and the relationship, and recognize when you first start this and you agree to a contract of some sort, it should be that, we'll evaluate in a year's time, and both parties should be able to say, I'm not sure this is effective or working well. You've got to kind of figure out how to do this in nice ways so that you don't break personal relationships. But if you establish clear goals and you're honest about it, and there's no negativity in terms of the feedback, personal negativity, then the decision that it's not working, I think, can actually work quite well. And look at the last part. Most relationships actually end through mutual neglect rather than mutual agreement, and it's much better that you decide that this is not the right thing rather than it just petering out, because those typically are failed mentoring relationships, and my guess is that the mentee has not accomplished very much under those circumstances. So, and by the way, I have to thank Mitch Feldman at UCSF for some of these slides. Mitch is the Vice Provost of really faculty development at UCSF and has really led much of the scholarship that's out there on mentoring. And he's been out here twice to be our keynote speakers at our annual mentor training sessions. Well, actually came before the first one and then came for the second one. So he's fantastic, and a lot of these slides are actually from the presentation he gave that he said I could share. So he did a Fulbright scholarship in Japan, which is where this slide apparently came from. So what are the 5 characteristics of outstanding mentors? Well, mentors have to have the time commitment. They need to be enthusiastic and ultimately altruistic. I mean, you can argue that mentors should be getting paid for their effort, and we've tried to encourage some departments to do that, but that's nowadays with money as tight as it is, that's difficult. So it ultimately boils down to altruism. They need to act as a career guide. They need to support the concept of personal and professional balance, and really the reason that at a very biological level why we do this stuff, I presume, is because we feel like we want to leave a legacy of how to be a good mentor, so this could be passed on from generation to generation. And then what are the characteristics of successful mentoring relations? Well, I think reciprocity is important. Altruism, only goes so far. The mentor at some level has to feel like they're getting something back, and I think good mentees will do that. There needs to be mutual respect, and I think clear expectations are very, very important. There needs to be some form of personal connection and shared values, and this actually came from the qualitative study that Mitch Feldman actually ran. So what are the reasons that these relationships sometimes fail? Well, just as in medicine, you have a differential diagnosis of a clinical problem. You can often find a differential diagnosis of the problem with mentoring, and some of them are mentee-centered, some are mentor-centered, and some are actually programmatic. But some of the mentee-centered ones are, and I've seen these, well, at least I've blamed them on the mentee in this situation, is that you have mentees that really are ambivalent about their careers. They haven't truly decided whether they want to be researchers, and they're unclear about their direction. They're very passive, and they often go together, the first two. mentees often struggle with work-life balances, and that sometimes fits in with the idea of juggling being a clinician and a researcher. They haven't articulated clear goals, and there may be some personal issues. So those are some of the reasons that, from a mentee's perspective, that it can fail. But from a mentor's perspective, a lack of experience mentoring and training is important. Some folks are just not ready to be the lead mentor. They haven't had the experience, and they've really failed to set clear expectations from the mentee. So those are some of the reasons that it can fail from a mentor's point of view. I think one of the very common ones too is that mentors aren't truly altruistic. They're doing it in part because the mentee serves a purpose for them. They're not giving enough independence. They're doing it more from kind of self-centered reasons. That doesn't work very well either. And then from a programmatic point of view, if there isn't an institutional or departmental commitment to mentoring and a lack of a formal mentoring program overall, and the culture of the institution is not pro-mentoring, then that can be a real problem. So I think, and that's something we've been working hard at MBC, is to try to change the culture of the institution as a whole and the departments to really foster mentoring so that it becomes part of the standard of care, in a sense, for taking care of our junior faculty. And so some of the characteristics of failed mentoring relations from this paper was poor communication, a real lack of commitment on both sides, some personality differences, perceived competition and a conflict of interest, and then the lack of experience, knowledge, and skills. And many of this can be worked on. The communication can certainly be worked on. The lack of commitment is often a big problem. Personality differences are problems, and the perceived competition can be a real problem too. So some of these are not very easily fixable, whereas some of them are. Not easily fixable, but are fixable. So to conclude the kind of first part of this discussion on effective mentoring relationships, the take-home points for mentees are: mentoring is key to your career success and satisfaction. Invest the time to find the right mentoring team. I would argue very strongly in this kind of era of team science that one mentor is probably, it can work, and it does work many times, on, individual science, but with team science, which is kind of where things are moving much more, a team of mentors is really necessary. The mentee needs to be proactive and learn to manage up. Mentoring should be reciprocal, so look for opportunities to teach your mentor something and give feedback. And it's very important that you take time to reflect on your values, skills, and your goals, because that will form the foundation for the decision-making on both sides, the mentee and the mentor. I'm going to turn now for the second half of my talk to how do we measure successful mentoring. And this is actually, this is a challenging topic. The science and the metrics for figuring this out haven't really been worked out. And so this is something that I've kind of just conceptually come up with myself, presented it at our annual CTSA training program. A bunch of CTSAs and other folks have seen this. It's on the web and have used it and said that they found it helpful. So I hope you'll find it helpful too. If you think about it, the mentor-mentee relationship is very complex, consists of multiple interactions and across a broad spectrum of activities. And so there are potentially many different measures of effectiveness. There are multiple outcomes, and some of these are difficult to measure. They're both quantitative and qualitative outcomes, and both are important. So you need to kind of come up with metrics that deal with both of those. If you think about what the quantitative metrics of a mentee relationship might be, there are the demographics of the relationship, which you can quantify, and I'll show you that in a moment. And then there are some objective outcomes from the relationship that you can measure as well. In terms of qualitative metrics, these are usually more touchy-feely evaluations of each of the components, the mentor evaluating the mentee evaluating the mentor, and there are issues related to that I'm going to talk to you about. So let's talk a little bit about the demographics of the relationship. This is actually pretty easy stuff to measure. These are examples. So the characteristic would be the department, the rank, the trank, the gender, the race. You can document all of that. And was there a mentor contract established at the beginning? Was an IDP formed? What are the frequency of the meetings? What are the duration of the typical meetings? How long has the relationship been going on? Is there more than one mentor? So these are things that you could conceivably see putting into a multivariate analysis of the outcome of mentoring and see whether any of these things made a difference. So those are pretty easy to measure. When you look at the objective outcomes, the way I thought about this was that when you think about what the ultimate goal of mentoring really is, it's really about career development and advancement. That's why we do this. And in a way, you might argue that one of the best ways to measure this is by progress towards promotion. And so, because the requirements of promotion are frequently measurable, committees, the P&T committees often look specifically at quantitative measures so that they can decide whether someone should be promoted or not. So for example, this is the grid for promotion from an associate professor to full professor at MUSC in the different tracks: academic investigator, that would be typically a PhD investigator. This would be a PhD investigator who is an educator as well. This is an MD investigator, and this is an MD clinician educator. And these are the criteria, and these are required or thought to be important but not required. And you can see some of these have numbers associated with them. So, and I'm going to focus on research-oriented faculty because that's what our programs are working with right now. Both the CTSA and the Delaware programs are working with trying to advance clinical translational junior researchers. So I'm still at using that associate to professor. So if you look at the rank there, these are the tracks of the academic investigator and academic clinician, and you can see what's required, what isn't. And many of these are actually quantifiable. So for example, the number of grants submitted, the number of grants funded, these are very straightforward, and all of us do this all the time. The number of first authored publications, the number of senior authored, the importance of the publication's impact factor, was an editorial written on the papers, and then career development progress of mentee with number of presentations at national and international meetings, invited presentations, election to study sections or specialty societies, and then did the mentee participate as a mentor, because nowadays our promotions does take into account mentoring as part of the requirement for promotions to professors. So the number of individuals mentored, the similar achievements of those mentees, and then did this mentee who's going up for promotion contribute to research-oriented committees at the department, college, university, and national and international levels? Was there leadership in appropriate department, colleges, universities? Were there any research awards? And ultimately, did the mentee get promoted? So for our programs that Rob and I are running, the ultimate standard that I think we're going to be judged for is how many times did we take a junior investigator scholar who got in our case, the KL2 grant, who actually got an extramural grant at the end of, and was independent. For us, that's the most important yardstick. But these are some ideas, and you can see there, many of these are quantifiable and are fairly straightforward. It's much more complicated in the clinician educator and academic education track. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this now because these aren't the folks that we're really focusing on. These are people who spend most of the time seeing patients and then teaching and not doing very much research. And the requirements are very different for those folks. But even then, you can quantify. There are some metrics that you quantify. For example, clinical load in terms of RVUs. Did they develop in any innovative clinical care? In other words, did they start a new program like telemedicine, new surgical techniques? Did they organize a new clinical service to foster clinical care or medical education? Developing a database for clinical research would be an example. Documentation of teaching activities, a teaching portfolio. So there are ways that you can do this. I'm not going to spend more time on this now because, as I said, we're mostly focused on the researchers, but I just wanted to point out that even in the clinician educator and academic educator tracks, there are quantifiable ways to document progress. So when the questions comes up, are products the most important part of the metric for mentoring? I think most committees would go by the fact that they are, because they're much more quantifiable, and you can kind of use them to compare candidate to candidate much easier. The products are much easier to measure. And if the mentee is productive, then you presume that the mentor is doing a good job, but that isn't necessarily the case, right? You could have poor mentorship and a successful scholar and vice versa. So it would be nice to have metrics somewhat other than the product metrics to provide an opportunity, especially for early evaluation of relationships, to solve a problem. Many of these products are you only get to see them years after the mentoring process. And so you can't really use the product to know whether it's effective. And that's where the qualitative feedback that you get early on in the mentoring relation can help you to determine the effectiveness of the program. So let's talk about now some of these qualitative ways of evaluating the effectiveness of mentoring relationships. And Burke and his colleagues wrote this paper some time ago, measuring the effectiveness of faculty-mentor relations. They used a Likert type scale for things like my mentor was accessible, rating them on a scale of 0 to 6, all the way down, my mentor demonstrated professional integrity. And you put your stuff down there and you rate your mentor. The problem with that kind of approach is that there are barriers to that, right? There's a lack of anonymity, and the confidentiality issues means that are you truly going to get honest feedback? And you have to recognize, even though you'd like the mentee-mentor relationship to be kind of an equal footing, there is a power, in a sense, a potential for power differentials there, and the mentees may not feel very comfortable giving honest feedback in that situation if it's not anonymous. The feedback is subjective, which, so it doesn't necessarily reflect what actually happened. It might be the mentee's perception, but it may not be the overall truth. And even when you give that kind of feedback, mentors may not be willing to recognize their faults or change their behavior. And unless you have a cultural, institutional cultural, departmental cultural thing where the chair steps in, it might not result in anything changing. So there's been this other strategy that's being proposed for evaluating, giving feedback to mentors. And this involves a kind of a new model to evaluate the mentor relationship. And it really requires the mentor and mentee to buy into this concept where they will both attend a training session that highlights best practices of mentoring. They come to a real understanding of what's needed in the relationship, that feedback is going to be a key part of it. They have a program advocate that helps attend some of the meetings to kind of smooth out issues or help support them, and would kind of help avoid any red flags. And then there's a recognition right up front that there's going to be honest feedback with the intent to make it a stronger relationship, and not as an intent to be demeaning or be negative, but really to try to improve the overall mentoring experience. So that paper talks about this model. I think it has some real advantages, but it does, again, require buy-in from the mentor and the mentee to kind of develop that kind of relationship and have that kind of honest feedback mechanism. So you might want to know, talking about metrics, what are the mentoring programs in the CTSAs around the country actually doing? And so there has been this national survey. We actually participated in this. And these are the different years that the CTSAs were granted. The first time was 2006. There were 12, 11 in 2000. These are institutions, 14 institutions, 8 in 2009. And they asked these various questions. I wanted to kind of get you to focus on the bottom here, which is, was a mentor contract used? And these are all at institutions that you would have thought would have drunk the Kool-Aid by now. And it turns out that, you know, a minority are still using contracts. A pretty small minority are actually have developed mentor training programs. Less than half, especially later on, have formal evaluations of mentors, and very few of them actually have fiscal incentives for mentors. So this stuff is still evolving, even at the institutions that have been funded specifically to do this stuff. You can see that it hasn't really reached the point where it's been done on a full, you know, in a high percentage of cases. The ultimate metric, though, you might want to think is, and I think is, does mentoring actually work? There are folks that believe that, you know, successful people are going to figure out a way to get it done no matter what, and does actually mentoring work? Now, that I think that that's actually true. Really talented people will figure out a way and may not have ideal mentoring and be successful, but that's not the point. The point is to try to make people who aren't the absolute stars, the 5 or 10% that are going to make it on their own, but maybe the 30 or 40% that really need that little bit of help to kind of push them over and get funded. That's what we need to think about in terms of mentoring. It turns out that it really hasn't been systematically studied. There are very few papers on showing the effectiveness of mentoring. I've listed a couple here, and they all have kind of qualitative conclusions. None of them were rigorous quantitative stuff. There has been one randomized trial published this year. This was a randomized trial to evaluate whether a mentor training program actually helped with respect to the mentors feeling like they were more accomplished, and then the mentees actually feeling like their mentors were more accomplished, and was measured on this scale that I'll show you in a moment. And this paper actually just came out in May of this year. And the primary outcome was the change in the mentor's self-reported pre-test to protest competence scores in the mentoring competency assessment. Secondary outcomes included changes in the following: mentors' awareness is measured by their self-reported retrospective change, mentees' rating of their mentors' competency on that score, and mentoring behaviors reported by mentees and their mentees. And you will see down here that on all of those measures, those mentors that were randomized to a training program versus those that just did things in the usual way actually did do better. What I'd like to see, and I've actually thought about doing, is actually a randomized trial where you didn't evaluate the mentor, but you evaluated the success of mentees based on whether they had a mentor who might have had this training program versus another kind of mentor. So I think that the science of proving that what we do is effective is still pretty limited. But the fact is that if you ask almost any mentee whether they think mentoring has been helpful to them, almost all of them will say yes. So it's one of those things where, yeah, you might want to look for some real hard data, but I think we all kind of know that it's critically important to have a mentor, and to do it well is very important. But I would like to see a randomized trial that absolutely showed that. So there you'd be randomizing the mentees and not the mentors, and that would give you some, and looking at the products of the mentees to see whether it made a difference. That would be a nice randomized trial. So in summary, on the metric side of things, we certainly need more reliable data on best practices for effective mentoring. The CTSAs have played an important role in trying to develop those. The available data, whilst limited, suggests that effective mentoring does improve the productivity of mentees and improves the mentoring skills. Mentor training improves the mentor skills. And we all know that mentees who have been effectively or ineffectively mentored, they certainly know it when they've got one or the other. I think it's important that we develop key metrics on each mentee-mentor relationship, as well as department and institutional-wide mentoring programs. These should be both quantitative and qualitative to track the success of programs, to provide the feedback that's needed to improve the relationships between mentees and mentors. And whilst the qualitative metrics pose potential interpersonal challenges, they can be overcome if there's a priori commitment between the mentee and mentor in this regards. And having a contract and discussion up front about it would lead to honesty and make that easier to do. So that's the end of kind of my, I don't want to take, I'd rather use any time for questions. I didn't want to be too didactic on this, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
That was fantastic, Mark. Thank you. So how do we handle questions on this?
They can just unmute and ask. And
they can unmute and ask. So let's open it up. Are there any questions from the folks who are in the different rooms or online in their offices?
I have one question.
Yep.
Identify yourself.
It's Seema. So, you know, so it's very interesting, this question of who, you know, really needs mentoring to succeed, and who's going to succeed on their own, and who isn't going to succeed even with the best mentoring, I guess. Because some of those things that you talked about that contribute to the failure of the mentoring relationship in terms of lack of commitment or not really knowing what they want to do or all those things mean that even if the mentoring is very good, these people might not be successful by sort of the metrics of promotion and things like that. On the other hand, you know, is there a version of success that's you get them out of the wrong track onto the right track more quickly, and they're happier and they lose less of their life pursuing something that they're never going to be good at? How do you incorporate that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right about the latter. So in a situation where you have a failed relationship because of lack of commitment or uncertainty, oftentimes that does lead to a realization that, you know, I'm not on the right track, and maybe you should switch from a clinical investigator track to a clinician educator track. So in that regard, you might argue that that was a successful mentoring relationship because you both come to a recognition that that's the right strategy. I think I would define a failed mentoring relationship as one in which the mentee really wants to be a researcher, and in the end doesn't get the product that's needed to get promoted and be successful. So that particular example, I agree with you, probably is an example of a reasonable relationship, because the outcome was that the mentee came to a recognition that they didn't want to do this, and that's an important outcome, right? I do think the bigger challenge, though, is, you know, when someone really wants to do it and they don't, maybe they just aren't cut out for it. At that level, again, honesty is a very important part. I think there, the challenge for the mentor is to try to most people who really want to do it, who've already reached the level that they're at, they might just need a little change in direction. It might be that the research they thought they wanted to do and they're not really cut out for, they don't have the skill set for, maybe the mentor could kind of push them into a different direction where they feel more comfortable and make them realize that this is actually a good area for them. So that's where I think the guidance from a mentor to kind of get them to. I've actually recently had a relationship with a mentee who actually got a VA Career Development Award, was doing it, and then halfway finished that and was writing a merit and decided that he actually just missed patient care. And the educational side of it was much more interesting. He didn't want to spend his life writing grants, and he actually left the institution and went to a more clinically oriented place and was very comfortable and happy with it. And what I try to do in that situation is just make him sure that he had already thought about it and that's what he wanted to do. And in the end, I was comfortable with the fact that this is someone who already had a VA Career Development Award, had real talent as a writer and researcher. He was actually very productive with papers, but realized that he didn't want to spend the rest of his career writing grants, and was able to come to that decision, and I was okay with it. I mean, in the end, it's not what the mentor wants, it's what the mentee wants, and I was comfortable that he really had thought through it and realized what his passion was. It took him a long time, and he wrote a lot of papers, probably, not for nothing, but in the end, that wasn't what got him to where he was at his current level. So I think it's just a question of being open and honest and letting the mentee kind of self-discover in a way and trying to guide them to that. I was a long-winded answer to the question. Sorry.
This is
You're up, Lloyd.
okay. Oh, hi. This is Lloyd Work. So we're working now with developing a crew of mentors to meet with our mentees, and we're in an environment where unofficial mentoring has been going on for years. And so how did you reach out in your institution to mentors and perhaps share with them that, here are some resources to be better or more effective mentors? One thing I've observed is among some of our potential mentors, some resistance to taking any webinars or participating in any training, and so how do we help elevate our mentors, and how did you find you could reach them?
So the way I did it, I moved to MUSC in the role of Associate Dean of Faculty Development. This is before we had a CTSA. And I think what I realized was that you can't really just find mentors. The guys that want to do it or the ladies who want to do it are probably doing already. The only way you can kind of get enough folks to do this is to change the culture of the institution. So what I did is I went to our provost and told him that we wanted to develop a mentor leadership council that would be an institutional mentor leadership council in which all the colleges were represented, and we got the buy-in of all the deans of those colleges to form this mentor leadership council where we actually strategized about ways to improve mentoring on campus. And the first thing we did was develop a framework for departmental mentoring plans that the deans then required all the chairs of the departments to institute in their own departments. They could adapt the plan. But so our strategy here was to try to do this culturally at the institution and make the chairs recognize the value of mentoring, and then let them tell their departments that this was a priority. And in that way, and in each department, we identified a mentor champion who would kind of oversee the departmental mentoring plan. So that's kind of the way we decided to do it. And I've got to say that I think it's been successful in the sense that mentoring is something that is spoken a lot about on campus now that wasn't spoken about before. How effective each departmental mentoring plan is that's another issue. But the topic of mentoring, the importance of mentoring, is now out there and being spoken about. With respect to kind of then what we did within the CTSA when we got that funded was that under the Mentor Leadership Council's guidance, we developed kind of mentor training programs. We have this monthly series called Tools for Mentors and Mentees, where it's basically a topic that's relevant to both mentors and mentees. And we have a presentation on by a good speaker, and that's an opportunity for mentors and mentees to come to, and we give it during lunchtime once, and then we give it in the evening once, so that folks with different schedules can come. We do the annual mentor training program. So that's kind of how, and then there are online mentoring courses that folks can take. Excuse me, that Wisconsin CTSA has an online mentoring training program that you can take that's helpful. The truth is that, nowadays with money as tight as it is, it's hard to get folks to be willing to be committed mentors. And in the end, ultimately, it's done by, a cadre of very passionate people that are committed to it in the most effective way, I think. And then the people that are lucky enough to get, the kinds of grants, the K grants, the MRDA grants, those kinds of things where they have to have a mentor, that's probably where most of the successes are going to be coming from. Does that help in any way answer your questions?
I believe having the mentoring council, engaging the chairs, having the tools and the resources, those are perhaps steps that we can adopt.
Yeah, I think that developing some online resources for mentors and mentees is good to have. But I do think it's good to get folks together that are mentors. So an annual mentor training program, or a monthly gathering that you would call whatever you wanted, where you would go over some relevant mentoring topics. I do think that there's value in getting people together and having them share their experiences. Forming the other thing we've done is, we formed an email group. The mentor champions in each department are on a kind of a common web group that share ideas. And we've had successful mentor champions in departments then start developing their own mentoring programs that are then shared with other departments. And actually, Rob and the Delaware group have had one of our Department of Medicine has done a remarkable job taking this on, and have that the IDP that is now being used in Delaware and some other ideas have actually come out of our Department of Medicine's mentor champion. So I think once if you can get a few successes and you can get some people that are really excited and take it on, develop some new ideas and programs, and then share it with other departments, and you have the institution saying this is important and the leadership saying it, then it slowly kind of percolates out there, and I think that's kind of the strategy we've taken. And I think I'm told by folks that have been here for a long time that you can't compare the way we think about mentoring now than even 5-10 years ago. So I it's a long process, but I think you've got to get the kind of leadership on board. And when I actually came to visit Rob, I think that was kind of a message I was trying to give to there at the time, that it's not just trying to identify just a cadre of mentors, but it's the idea of making those mentors feel valued. So you could develop a kind of a mentor award, an annual mentor award. There are ways of kind of making people feel like what they're doing is valuable, even if you're not going to give them salary support to do it. Recognizing them through promotion, criteria, that kind of stuff. I think that's how you kind of can impact it.
That's great. I think, Julie, did you have a question?
Yeah. Mark, thank you very much. It was great talk. You talk about how, the decision is in the hands of the mentee, and I'm wondering how you deal with situations where the mentee is not taking responsibility for the relationship, is not doing their part to seek out help or, to connect.
I think you just got to be honest with them. Firstly, right up front, when you agree to be their mentor, I think it's important you let them know that they have to kind of show initiative and lead the way. And every time they don't, I think you should point it out to them. And if you establish up front that you're going to be honest about it, and you're going to give that kind of feedback, my experience is that, most people take it on. And if they're not, it's usually a sign that they're not really committed. So I think that then the kind of take them to the back and say, okay, let's have an honest discussion. Why is this happening? Are you really sure this is right for you? What's going on? Maybe there's some personal stuff. I don't know. That's where you have to have a kind of an honest discussion. And if the outcome of that discussion is, I really don't, I've decided I don't want to really do this, it's not, then that's okay too. And then you're basically saving both of you valuable time. So I think it's just a question of being honest with them and letting them know up front that that honesty about that kind of stuff is going to be forthcoming. So then it's not that it doesn't come, if you don't have that honest discussion up front, you let it go 6 months, and then all of a sudden you express frustration that they haven't taken the initiative, they're going to wonder where that came from. But if you have that discussion right up front and say, these are the expectations, I'm going to expect you to set up the meetings, or let's have it in our calendar. Let's set it up right now on this time, or it's going to be your responsibility to do this, this, and this. And if they don't, you call them on it, and in a nice way. My experience is that people who want to do it really respond to that, though, and they will take the lead. I don't have too many wallflower mentees. There are mentees that I have to remind them, hey, we haven't met for a while. Email my assistant, set up a meeting. That's a little bit annoying to me that I have to do that more than I feel like I should, because I really think that's their responsibility. I'm busy enough not to have to remember the last time I met with one of my mentees. But yeah, I tell them, hey, we haven't met. Why is that? You set these up, and so there's a fine line between becoming good friends. I don't think that's a good, it's like your kid almost. You don't want to be best friends with your children, right? And you probably don't want to be best friends with your mentee. You want to have a good relationship, but it's got to be one with their expectations and honesty. And so, and usually that happens because there is this kind of difference in seniority that makes it, that doesn't make it entirely a straightforward friendship. It's more than that. So that hasn't been a challenge for me. Have you had some challenges in that regard? I'd be interested in hearing how you dealt with that.
Yeah, I've been spent more time trying to get the mentee to connect with me than he has. And so I think I do need to just be clear about what the expectation should be.
Yeah, that's what I would recommend.
So
Thanks.
Marie Stewart?
She's stepped out. I have a question though. Are these Rob Mason at Nemours? Are there any good studies on the value of the mentoring programs to the institution? Obviously for the mentee, there's plenty of value to them. Mentor may be altruistic. And what about value to the institution as a whole? Some good studies to quantify that?
Yeah, there was a paper, and I'll get I can send it to Rob and he can distribute it. There was a paper that showed that mentoring decreases the loss of faculty, and from a financial point of view, is an enormous win. You're almost to the point where you'd say, well, then institutions should be funding their mentors, because the ability, the retention rates at institutions that have good mentoring programs is much higher. So there was a paper. It's a pretty old paper, but there was a paper on that. That's the only one that I can think of the top of my head. I mean, without quoting papers now, but it's, if you look at, successful relationships that lead just from the extramural funding point of view, the translation of successful mentoring relationships in the extramural grants is much higher. If you look at the program, our scholars who go through our KE mentoring program, the success rate with extramural grants compared to faculty that are not in the program and are getting kind of ad hoc mentoring the way they're getting it, it's not nearly as good. So I don't have a paper on that, but there is that paper on retention rates that mentoring improves.
It's Rob Aiken, the other Rob up at Nemours. That's great, and I think there's a big recognition at Nemours and other places that recruitment of these faculty is costing them millions. Once you look over the first few years and how much it costs to train somebody, get them in the system, get everything up and going, and the value proposition for a mentoring program is per person, hundreds or thousands of dollars. So the more data, I'm a data geek, as I think a lot of people on the phone are, more data showing that's the case would be great. And it's getting close to 4:30. I know Marc's committed to 4:30, and I want to make sure that we don't impinge on his time too much after that. But I want to circle back to this idea of a trial. And I would love to talk more about it, maybe on another occasion we can talk about how we will design a trial. One of the things I want to throw out there, my feedback on myself. It might be Marc's. So I'll try to fix the feedback here for a second. One of the things I like to throw out there, Marc, is when you started with the challenges that mentees are faced with and sort of what they need to be successful. And you put mentoring on that list, but they need time, and it's a challenge for them to get time, and they need clinical coordinators. It's a challenge for them to get clinical coordinators. And there's a whole sort of litany of things that need to be overcome by mentees. And my sense is that mentees with good mentors overcome those problems quicker and more easily, and that there might be something quantitative in there, whether it's data we can get from the mentees about how well they're doing at overcoming or meeting the needs that they identified and overcoming these hurdles. And my question is, does MUSC do you get any data like that from the mentees? How's it going with these other aspects of what you're trying to manage?
Does your mentor help you?
And is the mentoring helping you?
Yeah, well, those resources that you talk about, it's all about money, right? So if you protected time, part of the reason why the case scholars have a higher success rate than junior faculty that are not in the K programs is because the case scholars are guaranteed 80% protected time, and they get the coordinators. They've got all these other resources. So it's not just the mentoring. It is, those other things are critically important. So, those things are very important. I'm not sure, me as a mentor, for example, if I'm mentoring a mentee who does not have one of those pay programs and is then reliant upon whether the chair is going to offer that protected time or not, and that is getting harder and harder to do. I have very little influence on our chair in terms of saying, oh, well, I think this guy's really talented, you should give him 20% protected time. That nowadays, that's very hard to do. So that doesn't answer your specific question was, do our mentees provide data on those resources? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, the resources help them overcome challenges. So for us, we essentially ask the mentees, what are the key things that you need? And then whether or not the mentoring program, back to Rob Mason's sort of question, whether the mentoring program helps them overcome the challenges that they sort of identify, the needs that they had. But getting those data are a little bit tricky. It's sort of how soon after they entered the program did they realize, oh, I can get offset time through an MRDA, and was having them enter the mentoring program part of them realizing that. I'm trying to wrap my brain around a trial type study that we could do using the program, the nascent program in Delaware, since we're just getting off the ground, and we're mimicking a lot of what's going on in South Carolina. That maybe we can talk some more about what specific measures we can get from the mentees. But I get the sense that mentees who are connected with kind of traditional mentors, at least in our system, they don't know what resources are really out there, and they're still struggling to try to figure out how to connect all the dots so they can get their grant submitted, and how to talk to their chair and what kind of information their chair is going to want to hear in terms of arguing for more protected time, that a mentor can help with that. So maybe we can kick those ideas around a little bit more, but that idea of having a trial, I love.
I'm showing that slide again about, you see it there? That has all the things that is needed for success. So yeah, any trial you did that tried to evaluate the impact that mentoring would have to control for all of these things, because they're all important in terms of the success of the mentee. And our K program pretty much offers all of this.
Mm-hmm.
We like to take the success of our K programs based on mentorship, but it actually maybe it has very little to do with mentorship, and it has to do with the fact that we provide the protective time and the startup funds and the statistical expertise and all these other things. So designing a randomized trial would be challenging because you'd have to control for all of these things. So one way to do it, if you just wanted to look at the mentoring, is to do it only within the K scholars and randomize the K scholars who got all of these to one or other different form of mentoring. Mm-hmm. That way you control for this other stuff. How you would do it in the context of your, I don't know how much of this stuff you're providing, but it really depends. If that's the variable you want to evaluate, you got to make sure that the groups that in your study are balanced with respect to these other things. Mm-hmm. And the only way we could do that is through randomizing our K scholars to one or other form of mentoring. So we could, for example, randomize people to peer mentoring only. You didn't get a senior mentor. You just came to K2R Club versus people who got a senior mentor, and everyone gets this. And seeing whether that senior mentor actually made a difference. Maybe just peer mentoring by itself would be good enough. Mm-hmm. There are different ways to do it. If I wasn't a stroke researcher, I would be doing that as my next randomized trial. But I'm going to leave that to you, Rob, since you've got plenty of time on your hands to design another randomized trial.
I have plenty of time on my hands. Well, I think we have to leave the discussion at that, unless there's a burning, urgent, quick question for Marc. And thank you very much, Marc. That was wonderful.
That was great. Thanks.
The slides are available through Aaron Riegel and through the mentoring core. So if anybody wants the slides, we'll make them available online. And I appreciate everyone's attendance. We'll do this again with another topic. When's the next one? Do we know when the next one is? Okay, we'll work on the next date and time for these gatherings. But thank you, everyone, especially Marc.
Okay,
wonderful.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.